Hello and welcome to Interdisciplinary and Cross-Sectoral Collaboration for High-Quality Real-World Evidence RWE Generation. As we wait a few minutes for further participants to join, I will share a few slides with you about this workshop and the Society itself. The 2020 annual meeting panel and workshop abstracts were reviewed by HTAI and its independent reviewers. HTAI had no involvement in the creation or development of the content and presentations for this session and is providing a platform only for presentation of such content and presentations. The 2020 virtual program includes oral, panel, plenary, poster, and workshop presentations being broadcast live throughout the rest of the year. The link to the full program can be accessed by following the link that will be in your chat box and accessed via the HTAI 2020 website. We would like to take the opportunity to thank you for being an HTAI member and remind you that as a member, you are invited to join one or more of the HTAI interest groups. To learn more about our interest groups, please see the link that will be in your chat box. Participants throughout the presentation will remain muted. To submit any questions during the presentation, please use the questions functionality on GoToWebinar. This may look like either of the two images shown on screen, depending on whether you have joined through the app or a web browser. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Your microphone will be unmuted at this point, and you will be able to speak if you wish. Thank you again for joining us. I will now hand over to our panelists to begin today's workshop. Just one moment, please. Elena, if you would please take over from me. It would seem that we have lost Elena. She will likely reload in a moment, but in the meantime, Masood, would you like to begin your presentation?
Let me do that. So thank you very much for joining this webinar. I'm Masood Tusi. I'm the chair of the Real World Evidence and Artificial Intelligence interest group in HTI, and we are going actually to present you this webinar. The first talk that we are going to present you is about generating high quality real world evidence, transparency, and with a focus on transparency and common data models. Okay, there's something which freezes my screen. Okay, so first of all, let me give you a little definitions, a few definitions actually. As you all know, clinical trials are, the classic and the standard way of collecting evidence for drugs and also sometimes for medical devices. Every kind of clinical evidence which is generated outside of the clinical the clinical trials is called real world evidence. This is somehow a definition by exclusion, because the type of evidence that you can generate from real world data is very, very vast. So whenever we are actually collecting and generating evidence regarding the usage, the benefit risks of a medicinal product or a medical device from the real world data, we are actually generating RWE. And RWD in this context is called, related to any data relating to patients' health status or the delivery of healthcare collected from a variety of sources outside of RCDs, as I mentioned. Now, if we collect the data for the purpose of the research, we call that primary data collection. If we use the data which has been collected for other purposes, We call that a secondary data collection. Now, if we have a look at the hierarchy of evidence, we see that typically, the number of real-world evidence studies has been much larger than the number of RCTs, especially in recent years. But still, RCTs are at the top of the evidence hierarchy, even if the RWE and RWD actually are trying to find their way into the decision-making of regulators and also HTA bodies. It could be useful to mention that actually RCTs provide, very good basis for the evaluation of efficacy, because there's the only treatment which varies and other elements are actually randomized. And also, they allow us to evaluate the real-world evidence, the evidence against placebo. However, they have a higher cost, and also they have some limitations, for example, for generalizability, and also sometimes they are impossible technically or ethically to conduct. And on the contrary, we have real-world evidence which can be generated in much more various situations, but we generally don't generate real-world evidence against placebo. And of course, due to the heterogeneity of these data sources and also the methods, we have also less confidence in the data and results. And this is exactly what we want to do here. We want to see how we can improve and where are the problems with regards to the confidence to real-world evidence. So first of all, in order to understand that, let's look at how we generate actually real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is generated through basically 3 steps. The first step is asking the questions. We need to ask meaningful questions. The second step is to identifying fit for purpose data. And the last step is conducting appropriate analysis. Now, if we look at the these different steps and different aspects of these studies, and trying to understand what actually where we have some more harmonization and where we don't have, we see that the clinical trials are much more streamlined than real-world evidence studies. Typically, in clinical trials, we have 3 types of design and some predefined endpoints. We almost in all cases, we submit them to IRB and IEC review. There are international harmonization which are accepted by all stakeholders, which actually apply in clinical trials and applied and followed in almost all cases. And in all cases, clinical trials are registered. Most of the time, they are registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And also for reporting, we have also a standard way of reporting. When you look at the RWE, this is not the case. So we have a whole bunch of different research questions, which are not very much standardized. You have different designs. You may or may not require to submit them for IRB IEC review. It's based on the country, the region, and the type of data collection that the type of data, secondary or primary data that you are using. And also in terms of standards, you have a variety of standards. And of course, in terms of transparency also, it is there are still a number of resources for registering the studies, but there is no common practice and obligation for all studies to be registered. And actually, if you look at the different recent events with some studies which have been published and then removed with regards to COVID, you see that those studies have not been registered anywhere. So to tackle this, there are a number of trends and initiatives which are ongoing. And my objective in here is just to give you a flavor of those initiatives. One of them, which is very important and is actually changing the landscape of the conduct of studies, is the common data models. Here you see a model, a simplified common data model. Here we are talking about observational medical outcomes partnership, or OMAP. Here you have different data sources. Schematically they have different structures. Imagine, for example, you have a primary data collection. So through a case report form, you're collecting the data here, and then you put that into a database. Here you have another center which is extracting the data from electronic medical records, and here you have some other databases which are actually collecting the information from claims data. So if you want to conduct a study which is encompassing all of these data sources, you naturally have some difficulties to match these data and pool these data. So what a common data model is doing is that it is translating all of these data models into a common data in such a way that the data can be collected and analyzed with the same methods for all of these data sources. And this is actually a very, very important aspect, which allows us to get closer to the way actually clinical trials are operating. Because in a clinical trial, wherever you are, all of your centers would use and collect information with the same data structure in such a way that you're able to actually analyze all of those structures. The next step in this model would be also to build some analysis. So for example, if you want to do some analysis of the survival of, or you want to do a risk evaluation, so here you build some analysis and models which would be applicable on the data regardless of what you have behind them, and so it allows you to analyze and generate high quality data. Here you see the different, on a map, you see the different members of Odyssey. Odyssey is actually observational health data science and informatics. These are the centers which basically use the OMAP model. And you see that all of these centers across the world can exchange their programs, and it actually executes their programs on each other's data sources. And you can see that this in future can be a very promising model for generating high quality data. The second point that I wanted to mention is the second point that I wanted to mention is the transparency. There have been a number of publications which have raised actually the fact that real world data should be more transparent. In other words, they should be registered, and prior to the analysis, the protocols should be registered in order to increase transparency and avoid that actually the study itself basically a fake study generated based on the trends that we are seeing in the data. So the protocol shall provide some hypothesis which has been posed a priori before the data extraction and analysis. And this has been also emphasized through a real world evidence transparency steering committee, which I'm part of, and through ISPOR, and now we are expanding that to ISPI. And actually in the near future, you will see that, you will see that we are actually currently working on a modern interoperable way of registering the studies and thinking about the incentives for registration of the study and the publication of registered studies through the journals, and also working on common models for protocols in such a way that in future other studies which are not currently registered in these three portals could be registered also in other portals, and then these portals can also communicate with each other in such a way that we can see more high quality data. And finally, this is my conclusion. I think that this standardization is going to change the future landscape of of the evidence generation. This causes actually a seismic difference. In the past, we had RCDs, which are the de facto evidence providers for the for any kind of efficacy and effectiveness. And there have been few evaluators at launch which evaluate actually in the HTA bodies the RCDs and make decisions based on efficacy and safety. But in future, we will have both RCD and real-world evidence which work together and maybe at the same level. And the groups which would evaluate these studies, which would be far beyond the only regulators and payers, it can be also patient groups and other groups who would evaluate and give their advice and position about the studies. And of course, the insights that will be generated, but they will also cover outcomes, costs, and comparative effectiveness. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I hand over to Elena, if Elena's joined.
Yeah, I joined immediately.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Masoud. I joined immediately after, but we thought it was more streamlined to let you to speak. Thanks very much for this quite comprehensive overview of what we have in terms of RWD, RWE, and hierarchies. Just to say that we started this discussion to generate this panel because we thought it was important to have as much as possible an interdisciplinary approach. And in the process of generating it, we discovered we should go more basic, or as basic as possible, because between engineers and lawyers and doctors and economists, we all used different language, and we had limitation on the number of acronyms we were familiar with towards each other. Also because we tried to give it a more global, if you like, perspective. So what I would like to say, and I think Bryce will also do it, if you have questions or if you have feedback and so on, please write it or add it in the chat, or feel free to email us. So we will go into longer interventions. Everybody will present for 10 minutes or a little bit longer, but we do want to have comments and questions in the end, because we try to touch upon legislative standards and technical standards and clinical endpoints and standards, and it's quite challenging to do in under an hour to allow time for dialogues. That's it. Thanks, Masoud, very much. We have something specific for you. I don't think we have something in the chat, but then we leave it for the end for everyone. Okay, and then I will introduce Catherine, who is the second panelist. So Catherine Kronaki, Catherine, I don't know if you can hear us or see us. Can see Catherine's microphone is turned on, but hello.
Hello.
So,
hi, everyone.
Hi. So Catherine is president-elect of the European Medical Informatics. This is also the Secretary General of HL7, which is technically a standard, I think, although not everybody may be familiar with it. Some may be very familiar with it. So thanks for agreeing to give us an overview or a taster of what we have in terms of standards and interoperability challenges. I don't know whether you can share your screen, because in my screen I can still see Masoud's presentation. Maybe Bryce, you help us with that?
I can see Catherine's presentations, actually.
Okay, I still see yours, I'm afraid, but if you can see Catherine's, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Catherine, please go on.
So hello, everyone. If you know about HL7, just drop us a line on the chat. My brief presentation today in this interesting panel about the value of real-world evidence and the approach that we follow is taking a different angle. It is talking about work that is done, and for me is kind of fundamental in the thinking that we have in the data economy, and that's international patient summary. That's a patient summary that each of us has. And actually my controversial statement when I was asked by Elena to provide one was that every person has this patient summary, and in this patient summary we have our vaccination certificate, very pertinent to the COVID era, and at the same time we have the possibility to use the data in the patient summary to access different kinds of information about health and essentially gravitate towards health. So this is my basic argument. And if we manage through standards to achieve adequate quality of data, then we can definitely support health technology assessment and create high quality evidence that would create a revolution in the way we make decisions about treatment, as Masoud earlier said. So let me start. Just an overview of my presentation here. First of all, the standards that HL7 has created over the years started with V2 and then CDA and FHIR, which are two standards that are very much promoted in the context of electronic health record data. But what hasn't been addressed adequately, I think, is the International Patient Summary, which is a cross SDO, a cross standards development organization activity that can support HTA in real world data. And I would like to see more evidence to this effect in the future. So that's why I'm creating this presentation and I'm talking about that. There are different case studies that already HL7 Europe is participating. It's funded by the European Commission in Europe. And some of them appear here, and I will briefly refer to them in the next slides. The first one is ExiHealth. This is a support action to create a European-wide electronic health record exchange format. That would involve laboratory exams, imaging, observation and result, discharge note, prescriptions, patient summaries, like I said, everything, the key core data. The question is, if we have this data in adequate quality, how can we synthesize data so that we can create real-world evidence of high quality? So another example that is actually using the patient summary is Gravitate Health. This is looking at leaflets and therapy plans through the lens of a patient summary. And the idea here is by engaging the individual, you can create better data, and you can link data from devices, which is the topic of today's panel, to data that come from the patients themselves, from their activities, from their behavior, health behavior, but also from medical records. Then there is the vaccination card, which is an initiative that appears in many countries. And in the UNICOM project, we are looking into unique identification of medicinal products. And by creating unique identifications for the vaccines that are coming up and using this information to populate registries, maybe we can have better evidence to make decisions about the public health. And next point is the survivorship passport. This is about the pathways, the life trajectory of people that encountered cancer early in life, childhood cancer survivors, and whether they could have this kind of patient summary as a survivorship passport that records interventions, studies that they participated, the kind of therapy that they underwent, so that they can fight against late effects. Very important, especially for rare cancers. And last but not least is probably the one that brings everything together, that's Fair for Health. This is about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable health data sets. How do we create the metadata that will allow us to create high quality health data sets that bring in data from different sources and allow us to ask important questions? I already mentioned my provocative statement that I think that putting the patient at the center and looking at the patient summary data in more settings would be a solution to actually taking HTA to the next level through real-world data. So a brief slide for HL7 for those of you that are not familiar with it. Its mission is a world in which everyone can securely access and use the right health data when and where they need them. Started in 1986 in the United States. Now it's present in more than 35 countries, 22 in Europe. The European office, which I lead, started in 2010, so we celebrate the 10 years. We are very much involved in European policy, but we also try to aggregate all the requirements from Europe and influence the creation of global standards. In that setting, we work with EFMI, the European Federation of Medical Informatics. We work with WHO Europe, with HIMSS Europe, with ECH Alliance, and we also participate regularly in the Standards Development Organization Joint Initiative Council. All right, so first point I made, International Patient Summary Standards. Cross-SDO activity engages citizen workforce, health system, and market perspectives. You can think of it as an active window to a person's health data across locations and jurisdictions. A dashboard that you can click on and explain why a certain piece of information is there. To make this happen, we need resources to accelerate implementation and sharing of experience. We need situations where it is productively used as part of guidelines. And we need to make sure that we examine and we apply provenance, granularity, and decision power in the most accurate way. To do that, HL7 Standards started in 2015, I think. They signed this agreement, which established the principles to be implementable, to be applicable for global use, to be extensible and open, to be sustainable. Here is an example of the pieces of the patient summary, the immunization section. And you see that there are examples, data, and you can all find them online freely and openly available. I will spend a minute here to explain a little bit the concept of the lens, which makes the patient summary active more than data, something that you can make decisions on. You see the lens of Gravitate, which we plan to implement in the next few years using medications and therapies as the groundwork. You see the medication list, the allergies, the conditions, the therapy plans, the personality, the lifestyle, the goals, the outcomes. Using this information, we hope that we can highlight the pieces of the therapy that are most important for the individual and engage the individual, the citizens, maybe the next of kin, in the treatment, make adherence more important, and collect at the same time real-world data. This is extremely important because we are not talking about data that are stored in a registry and are passive, but we talk about data that are actively used to improve care. But there are other examples, and you can see some here. For instance, the case of hypertension is one which engages very much medical devices and remote monitoring. And you can also, and you should, document the behaviors that are changing. Most importantly, however, from quality assurance, health goals, and early warnings, is to see the picture from above, from the perspective of the community. And this is also of raising importance at the face of COVID-19. We see disaster and emergency management. We see concepts of my healthy neighborhood that can be implemented by using the IPS standards. It's not easy, however. It takes a village, and it needs complementary actions that need multidisciplinarity and that need more than ever the practice of interprofessionalism. You need to work across professions. You need to learn from each other. You need to establish the social value of that. And this is challenging when we are taking into account security and privacy considerations. Another very important point that I would like to point out, and that's also essential, is governance of specification and standards. We need, as I said, to work across organizations and build on the value and the power of different standards organizations, but we also need to take into account from the beginning for every project, grassroots, the name of the initiative, the specification and standards that are used, linking to global standards, but also the governance of the specifications beyond the duration of the project. The stakeholders to be involved now and in the future, and most importantly, update and version management. As an example, I show you here some of the standards organizations that are involved in the IPS landscape and the different standardization products that they are creating. It is essential to note this graph here, which shows how the standards are actually evolving over time through the use, the maintenance, the monitoring, and the live deployment. In essence, and probably this is my farewell message to the panel and something to reflect on, we need to contribute to governance of interoperability standards. And this is an ecosystem that facilitates co-creation, governance at different layers, and strictness, regulatory strength, if I may so that we achieve alignments and evolution. We have different actors. This is some of them. We have different products that support the creation of standards. But most importantly, all this ecosystem is there to support a community of practice that works on a specific problem and that makes things happen. So in conclusion, real-world data and HTA need stronger ecosystems and a global community of practice that can apply co-creation, governance, and alignment and engage different perspectives, the citizens, the workforce, the health system, and the market. This is how we turn a strategic intent to the capability of to act. And that is my end of my presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I don't know, it was a very comprehensive presentation. I don't know whether everybody has had an opportunity to grasp the amount of effort that has gone over the years into generating the standards and into making them interoperable. And also, I think it's a lot of information for people to absorb. We did say that technically, although this was a panel, we're turning into a little bit of a workshop with all the information. But thanks for sharing and also for mentioning co-creation, co-development, and communities of practice. I think Brian will sort of open the focus as we go to next list. Some say is vice president. She's Medtronic, so she's the industry, it's medtech, and she's the vice president for global health, economics, and outcomes research. So it's Lindsey Boxted, who was kind enough to step in. And I have to say that when we started preparing for this workshop, there was a lot of discussion, as some of you may have seen in the abstract, on focusing on Hainan and the tourist zone. I think we will touch a little bit upon it in discussion in the panels, what we do in terms of evidence transfer and registrations. But I've asked Lindsey to show us a little bit in terms of a case study. So I hope that would be interesting to everyone. And thanks Lindsey, for sharing the screen. And I go off now.
Great. Well, thank you, Elena, and thanks for inviting me to participate in today's panel. It's a real pleasure. My name is Lindsey Boxted, and I lead health economics and outcomes research for Medtronic, working across the entire portfolio and all of our regions. And as you've heard and are aware, real world evidence and RWE is a very broad term for a variety of data, methods, and applications. I'm going to focus my talk today on Medtronic's perspective, a medical device manufacturer, particularly around how real-world evidence could be used in the context of HTA and payer decision-making, and also what we're doing internally to really drive standards to ensure transparency and collaboration. So I think you've heard from both panelists that there are increasing data, right? There's data everywhere, external trends with respect to more data availability, more data generation. But I think what's new or newer, in addition to the data quantity, is really around interest in acceptance into the real world evidence methodologies and from decision makers. And I think this is relatively new from our perspective. You know, a lot of real world data, real world evidence generation is not new. I mean, this is foundational observational research, but what's interesting and more new is the interest in how does this data fit into the broader evidence portfolio surrounding technologies, how can it supplement or augment traditional clinical evidence. And so that interest in this observational research has really driven a lot of interest from industry, but other stakeholders as well. Kind of in addition to kind of while there's increased interest in data, I think the counterbalancing and equally important work is around the establishment of formal frameworks around real world evidence applications, as Masoud alluded to as well, transparency in terms of rigor, analysis as well as, and then additionally patient privacy. There's a lot of emerging and new patient privacy regulations. So kind of combining all of these factors together around increased data availability and interest in applications, but also balancing that with, you know, ensuring rigor and patient privacy, all of these forces together really formulating the trajectory and future of real world evidence and real world data in decision making. So I think also what comes across to everyone as well is, you know, real world data, or RWD, is a very broad umbrella term, and everyone you talk to might have a slightly different definition of what real world data means. You know, starting at the top, I think secondary data, so data that was collected for a purpose other than research, so insurance claims, electronic health records, is one very important source of data, but it also, RWD encompasses, you know, data generated from devices, social media data, as Medtronic, data generated from our implantable devices, and also includes patient registries. And so I think the focus of my talk, while we're engaged as a company in all of these elements of real world data, the focus of my talk today is really around the secondary data, or that top part. So really leveraging secondary data or health data or claims in EHR for purposes of research. And the reason really for focusing on that today is it's also been a primary focus externally with respect to the frameworks being established. It's one of the more standardized sources of data, even though in this messy data space, it's a fairly consistent and established data sources. And I think really kind of what's also interesting in this space is the gray areas in the slide. So you're seeing not only these standalone separate sources, but there's now linking going across all of these different data assets, really opening quite a robust opportunity for research. So while there's increased data, as I mentioned, the real kind of interesting space for Medtronic, and I think for this space generally, is establishing of standards. So with respect to how do you assess these data are high quality or fit for purpose, the appropriate study designs to ensure you're minimizing bias and having the correct interpretation, as well as just transparency, not only in study registration, but methods, data, reporting, sensitivity analyses to really kind of gain rigor and trust with this kind of messier space. So as Medtronic, I think while we're focused in all of these particular areas, one real advancement I would say internally has been is really driving internal standards on how do you generate rigorous, reliable, replicable real world evidence so that you can have these multi-stakeholder collaborations. And kind of implementing these standards consistent with the external frameworks being developed by Duke Margolis, ISPOR, ISPI Task Force, et cetera. So while, again, real world data, real world evidence is a broad term, it's being used across the entire product development lifecycle for medical devices. And so everywhere from preclinical trial to post-market, and it really opens up a lot of opportunities. So in the preclinical space is really leveraging these types of data for understanding patient populations, unmet need, burden of illness, and using that data to help drive technology innovation for populations that have an unmet need or could with a new technology. But then as you move through kind of the life cycle on the bottom, we're experimenting and having pilots and doing research with respect to how do you integrate real world data more in a pragmatic sense by supplementing clinical trial data with longer term outcomes or broader indications or patient profiles alongside the clinical trials, but also post-market with respect to integrating or either augmenting or supplementing or replacing post-market surveillance using real-world data, as well as in the kind of the coverage, and I think the more traditional focus of the HTAI organization, but in coverage and in HTA, is how do you develop and use these real-world data sources as a condition of coverage or adoption or market approval as well. And then kind of going kind of full spectrum out, you can look at integrating the cost information that's incorporated in a lot of these data as well to begin to structure value-based contract agreements or to reconcile contracts as well. So really a broad spectrum of utility for real-world data, but again, for Medtronic, while we're engaged across all of these types of pilots and also research, is really making sure we're doing this in a trusted, consistent, and rigorous way. So I thought I would end with a little bit of a case example for Medtronic. And the reason I picked this one, while it's a US example, it is an example of using real world data for payer coverage, which for us is being done in the context of a policy in the US, but is also a potential framework to either be replicated for this particular technology in other markets or as a framework for other technologies as well. And this is referred to as the MICRA Coverage with Evidence Development, or CED study. This is a technology that is a leadless pacemaker that Medtronic manufactures and is a relatively new technology that essentially takes the two components of a traditional pacemaker, a lead and a battery, into one and implanted directly into the atrium. But during the coverage process with the US Medicare program, so the largest payer organization, in the review of their evidence assessment on determining whether or how they'll cover this technology, the payer, the agency, determined there wasn't enough evidence for a full coverage, just full national coverage, but they wanted a coverage with evidence development for this technology. And what that means is, as a condition of access to this technology and coverage, a patient needs to be enrolled in an approved study by the agency. And traditionally, CED is conducted with more patient registries with case report forms or a randomized control trial as well. So this is really a new space for CMS, Medicare program, and Medtronic, where we're conducting this entire study off of claims data linked directly to device registration data, which allows us to identify specific products and serial numbers of the device. So what's I think really novel about this is this study is running in the background. So providers don't have to fill out a thing except for their traditional submit a claim. And essentially every time a patient is implanted with a micro leadless pacemaker, they're enrolled in this study. So it de facto is giving access to this novel kind of breakthrough technology, but generating evidence simultaneously. So outcomes like short and long-term 30 and 6-month complications. We're looking at 2-year mortality. So really meaningful outcomes to the patient, but also to the payer. And I'll just point out 2 other kind of important, I think, points on this particular example. Is one, as we talked about standards, so there's the HL7 discussion, but also just standards in how we define outcomes, what ICD-10 procedure codes and diagnosis codes do we use and how do we apply that consistently, et cetera. This particular study includes an outcome validation sub-study. And what that means is while we're enrolling every Medicare patient in this study, so a few thousand patients every year, we have a subset of those patients that were enrolled in an FDA post-approval study, which is being conducted purely off of case report forms. And so we're able to see on this subset of patients, they're dually enrolled in both studies. So in the subset of patients, we're able to see if you observe a perforation in a traditional kind of case report form, adjudicated through a physician committee, if you see that on a particular patient, do we see in that exact same patient a perforation using real world data? And so that kind of foundational work allowed us to know that we're measuring consistently and accurately the outcomes in a much broader patient population. And the second piece I think that's really interesting and novel with this particular study is the agency identifies, the CMS, Medicare, identified that there was not an RCT for FDA approval. It was a single-arm study with a historical control. So there was not any concurrent comparative effectiveness or comparative efficacy work completed. And so that's included in this study objective where we're actually comparing the new technology to the predecessor or kind of comparative technology of a traditional pacemaker. And so, employing observational research methods to do that appropriately, but that's also, I think, really novel with this particular study where we're able to build off of that clinical evidence for FDA approval to a much more meaningful evidence base for a payer, much broader patient population, comparative analyses, et cetera. And to kind of tie back the whole focus on transparency, this is done with a pre-specified outcomes analysis, protocol sharing, and approval with the payer, as well as sharing annually with the agency reports, programming codes, sensitivity analyses. So we're really sharing everything with the Medicare program. So we're seeing this as an example of collaboration and transparency that we would, as a company, like to see replicated in other markets or other technologies, and as an opportunity to really shape the way real world evidence could be applied kind of pragmatically within the context of payer or HTA decision making. So I'll pause there and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Lindsey. This was very comprehensive. It was also very interesting to have a focus on the states. I don't know if there will be questions on that, but perhaps I hold my question because you touched upon points, endpoint libraries and protocols, and how cross companies we may align so that we generate even in RWE comparative effectiveness data. Also, there's a lot of grandfathering in devices. So the question was whether you plan to look retrospectively with new directives and legislation coming up. But perhaps we hold that until we hear also from Dimitra. And then, but thanks very much. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you.
So the last speaker is Dimitra Lindsey, who's a research fellow at the Aristotle University. She's also my co-chair in the RWE and AI with Masoud Tusi in the group. And what we wanted to briefly touch upon to sort of tie everything together is an aspect of standards which is very strongly emerging. And we see it also in the context of discussing secondary data and analysis thereof, which also Lindsey and Masoud touched upon. And to put, if you like, a twist in the sense of we see that technically we have a lot of collaboration moving forward, but at the same time we have stricter legislation. And to what extent would it be possible to really do evidence transfer or even data transfer across jurisdictions? So Dimitra, I don't know whether you have, I don't think you have your camera on.
Yes, I have my camera on.
I don't think so. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I go.
Thank you very much.
Tremendous connectivity issues, so my apologies. I think we are okay now, so I moved to a different place, but thanks very much. I pass on to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this operation. Thank you for this opportunity to share a legal perspective within this interdisciplinary panel. So my presentation is about legal standards and data utilization and evidence generation. So not every information is, we could say that it is personal data. And if personal data is every information that can be linked to a specific person directly or indirectly. It's not only the name, but also other identifiers such as the identification number, location data, online identifiers, or elements of identity of a specific natural person, that is cultural, economic, and also genetic elements. When an information becomes personal data, we have to every action about collection or processing operation should respect the core principles of data protection framework. The core principles are lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation. Data should only be used for a specific purpose. Data minimization, we should use not every data, but only specific and accurate data. Accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, and also accountability of the controller. Every data controller should be able to demonstrate that in every action of processing, all those principles have been respected. So the balance between all those principles is not a very easy task for the controller, as you see, as also GPR2 image can show. We can say that transparency legally is a core principle. Transparency has two basic levels. It covers the information that is addressed to people, to the subject of the data, to the owner of the data, to every physical person. Every information has to be simple, has to be easy to find, and also has to be addressed in a simple way to the public. Transparency also covers the processing. It requires that people should know that a processing operation is in force and should be aware about the purpose of this operation. So we could say that the balance is really difficult, and it becomes even more difficult when data protection has to be in balance with commercially confidential information. In the field of secondary use of data, we have a multi-level interoperability to effectuate. So operational, technical, and semantic interoperability has to be in line with legal interoperability. It is all of those levels has to be developed in parallel in order to be that the use of data should be effective in every legal order. So the legal frameworks in the field of data privacy are local mostly and not global. That creates huge issues of interpretation from one framework to another. So we have a regional character of legal standards in this in the field of data protection, and there are two models developed: the hard protection model and the soft protection model. Mainly in EU law, they follow the hard protection model by publication of regulation. Regulation is a legal text that is directly applicable to every member state without any prior action of implementation. There is also the framework of the Council of Europe, European Convention of Human Rights, where in Article 8 there is the principle of freedom of privacy of physical persons, and also the Convention 108 of the Council of Europe. In US, there is rather a soft protection model. There is case law and regional legislation and not federal, while in China, the draft of personal data protection law seems to rather follow the EU model. The regional character of the frameworks creates many challenges when in case of data transfers from one model to another, or in these specific examples from regarding data transfer from the EU to other countries. Recent decisions of the Court of Justice of the European Union, Schrems 2, has declared that all relevant stakeholders must ensure that the same standards of protections of European personal data apply in relation to transfers operating using other legal means, such as standard clause of contracts. So this decision is rather recent, and it's only time that we'll be able to demonstrate to us if we go towards a global and coherent regime of protection, or if these decisions practically creates no way out, since tools as Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor cannot be used anymore. So in nowadays, GDPR creates is a tool that will help us to be able to reach challenges that and issues concerning big data and also AI, because if questions arise within processing and collecting of data by a human collector, we can imagine how many more challenges can be created when this collection is effectuated by machines. So from a legal point of view, we hope that Big data and AI will go on working hand by hand with low science towards a fair and democratic future. Well, thank you very much. This was my introductory brief presentation on legal aspect. I hand up to Elena.
Thank you very much, Dimitra. Also for the update on the way China is going. I think we can be much more comprehensive with Japan generating its frame of exchange on the basis of values, one being trust to the government, which may be very relevant for Japan, but not necessarily for other regimes. But we would like, Bryce, I do not know if you can hear us, we would like to open the floor. And also we would like all of the panelists to open cameras. Hopefully the system will take it, and also not to have any presentations visible. We welcome, of course, we have on LinkedIn a posting, and we will try and wrap up in terms of messages with brief text from everybody and post it. And we welcome questions and feedback after the session, but we also very much would like to have comments and feedback and questions during the session. So I can see there are 15 or so people in the attending. So if you can type or send your questions, please do. And also, Bryce, I think you have to manually allow them to do that. Please do. But in the meantime, we can perhaps very quickly go around the panel. Oh, it's good to see all of you after 1 hour of technical issues. Okay, so I will start in reverse. I will start with Dimitra, who, being a jurist, I think, do you think it's possible to find compromises and have a legislative framework which supports secondary use analysis, but in a cross-border manner? And to make it more specific, we have been looking at what happens in places like the tourist zone, and whether this is relevant in terms of evidence transfer from China to Europe rather than the other way around. I mean, so far, to go there, to go to the Bao zone, you had to have a registration in the country of origin and to bring your evidence and then start generating RWE for evidence with coverage in the country. So the question is, can you see something like this happening in an area in Europe? Or can you see this kind of approach globally? And then I think I will go to all of you.
Thank you, Elena, for this very interesting and challenging question. I would say that Europe follows the rigid model, and that the recent jurisprudence has ratified this choice. So I would say that international law could, more easily that international law should adapt to the European model than the vice versa for the moment.
Okay, thanks. I mean, yes, I mean, but we all think, of course, our model is best, but thank you. Catherine, we have had the EU-US and the EU-China exchanges. So I know you can be very provocative in terms of agreeing or disagreeing when you want to have everything recorded and everything shared. What do you think is possible with China? And of course, generally, claims that, I mean, the US model is also soft, and we do discuss secondary analysis. The example from Lindsey is one, but it's bound to happen more and more.
I mean, the example for Lindsey was very informative, and thank you very much, Lindsey, for sharing this important information. It shows us that the traditional RCT model is giving way to models that are more outcomes-based and value-based, care-based. And this is tangible. How does this apply to different health systems? The Chinese health system being one is something that we will wait and see. There are some things that are local. Now, what becomes more interesting, and I raised the issue of the vaccines for COVID-19 because of that, is when we have a situation that is close to a crisis. You know, remember the old saying from Churchill, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. How do we deal with that is probably more interesting and informative, because there you can override certain, if I say, local standards.
Maybe we give some input for people attending and also for some of the people in the panel which were not part of this discussion. This pertains to utilizing the patient summary as a tool to empower the patient for vaccination status. And we all have had little vaccinations books traveling around, and there are different devices recording this information. And of course, the different devices being used to identify patient information when you go across countries. For example, whether you've been implanted with a device, whether you've been vaccinated with a device. The argument that you may have seen, we did manage, they say this in many panels, but I think also we did manage not to discuss COVID-19 for over an hour, but the vaccines are on their way. And of course, there's a discussion of an immunity passport being unethical if it's run for control or cross-border control purposes. But there's also a discussion of if you are vaccinated and you have vaccination status for a virus which has very little immunity over time, perhaps this is an empowering tool. So Lindsey, I know this is not your field, but then again, for devices also, you did say that we discuss with healthcare professionals or providers for protocols and so on. Do you co-create or do we discuss with patients, for example, for diabetes? I know that in the past, Medtronic was doing a lot of effort to co-create things for caring and so on. And indeed, you could print out your summary and cross-border movement was facilitated. It's different to vaccines, but it's a similar logic because you take on board the needs of the patient and also the needs of cross-border healthcare. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is in terms of the co-creation, I'm just going to use the leadless one as an example again, but that was created directly with physician groups on reviewing what outcomes, as well as with the payer organization on what outcomes are meaningful. And then we were tasked with how do you translate that into tangible definitions and coding and measurement. And that's, from my perspective, I mean, there's obviously, we're not collecting patient reported outcomes in this particular study. So it's not a patient outcome driven study where we have done that in the past. But what we do need to do is, it's more of a safety endpoint, but how do you translate those into other markets or other health systems? And that's something that is not easy, like we have common coding taxonomy, but using these secondary data, there's variation in what's coded, why it's coded, what the missingness might be, all of these things. And so I think it's very difficult to just take one protocol and replicate it across markets, which I think, getting input not only from the markets of what outcomes are important for decision making, but also incorporating, if possible, these outcome validation studies where you can get trust in how if you're measuring it, if it's truly translating into an outcome versus just assuming because the code's there, something happened. So I think it's a very difficult task, but I think the framework can be scaled.
We do see composite endpoints and consortia generating mutually acceptable. So there's progress there in collaboration, but perhaps we go to Masoud because from a CRO perspective, you get requests to produce meaningful, if you like, designs or data collection across jurisdictions. So is it, you think, can be compromised or not?
Yes, generally, there are some challenges, and that there are different ways to tackle these challenges. Many times, let me say, if there are 3 steps to do. The first step is that when you go from one jurisdiction to the other jurisdiction, you would hardly try to actually replicate your study in the same way in the new jurisdiction. So that would be your plan A. And then if your plan A fails for some reason, this can be unavailability of data, or unavailability of this infrastructure, or sometimes even unavailability of a large enough sample size to give you the power you need for your study. So if for any of these reasons you fail, then the plan B would be to do some trade-off. You say, okay, I have, for example, all of my endpoints, I have collected them from country A. Now I want to go to country B. I don't have all of my endpoints. I have some of my endpoints available. And then for some others, I will build proxies, and I will build some algorithms to actually simulate those endpoints. And for some other endpoints, I don't have anything. So this is plan B, and you do your study as in that way, and then some of the information of country A, you can apply them, and you can say that for some reason I think that I can allow myself to legitimately extrapolate the information that I have collected from my first country to the second country. And of course, you need to rationalize it. It should be reasonable decision making. And then you have a plan C. Plan C is basically you don't find anything in your country. And for some reason, sometimes the market uptake of your product or your drug is very low. That would be really difficult to compensate by any means. Sometimes the given country is impacted by something. You know, I remember a few years ago when in Greece there have been really a lot of manifestations and, you know, social warming, let's say. So any kind of study was not reasonable to do in that period. So because there were other priorities in Greece. So for that reason, we would say, okay, guys, let's take the information from another country and try to see how we can extrapolate this information to Greece. Or if this is a multi-country study, you say, okay, let's say Greece and Portugal are more or less the same, so we will do the study in Portugal and some other countries, and then we say that our study is representative of the European population, and then by the European extrapolation, you come down and you say, okay, so Greece is part of Europe, so this study will also apply to Europe, to Greece. So these are kind of models that I see that we very often actually use to tackle this question.
So starting from that last point, the granularity in these models is going higher, and they can be much more accurate. Yeah, of course, bigger margin of error potentially, but they're higher. But there's also, particularly as we have more personalized approaches in circumscribed populations, it can be potentially possible from multiple sources to potentially identify, if not a specific patient, but then some patients or group of patients in a specific locale, which touches upon other, if you like, issues, regulatory issues, legal issues, and so on. In oncology, this is very big because if you have a very small indication and 2 patients in Novosibirsk and 1 patient in Paris, it's pretty much triangulation. So the question would be, to what extent do you think it's justifiable to use secondary analysis data to complement or supplement evidence if you have a trade-off between producing better evidence and making better decisions? Because potentially, ultimately, this is what it will come to. So you think it's possible to ensure we have such a frame? And of course, whose decision is it in the end?
Yeah, you know, this is a very interesting question, because if you look at the charts and, you know, articles which provided the level of evidence like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would have seen that secondary data was considered as a lower reliability. However, today this kind of thinking is completely evolved. I mean, it has evolved, and today what we are talking about is fitting for purpose. Instead of saying that this data source is better than that one, whatever. We have, you know, in IQVIA, for example, we have conducted studies using pharmacy data, and for which actually pharmacy data is better than EMR data and better than claims data. So the data which comes from pharmacy sales, and you have a very major, you know, there we have published a major publication about paracetamol, and that paracetamol publication, which gives actually considerations, you know, about the liver transplantation caused by overdose of paracetamol. If you check that those words, keywords, you can find that study easily. It's called SALT study, and in that study, actually, there was no way, because paracetamol, curiously, I mean, it is not registered in any kind of data source, because paracetamol people just go and buy it. And so it was very difficult to find it in any kind of data source and say that, yes, in the EMRs, you can find all the information, or in other kinds. So pharmacy wholesales were the best use of paracetamol. So we, for example, for that study, we looked at the liver transplant caused by paracetamol overdose in each country. And then we put that on a denominator, which was the amount of wholesale of paracetamol per tons of paracetamol, not tablets, not kilograms, but tons of paracetamol per country, to see how you can actually see if there is a relationship, if there is a linear relationship between those liver transplantations and actually the tons of paracetamol sold in each country. So in this case, you go to a data source that if you bring that in a conference where people are talking about data sources, if you say, hey, can I use a wholesale data source as evidence reliably for regulators and HTA bodies, everybody will laugh at you. They will say no. But at the end of the day, if you use that data for its right purpose, it becomes a major publication in major journals, and it will have major impacts in terms of policy, in terms of healthcare policy making. So I think this should be really the way forward. We need really to look at where the data is fit.
Thanks. And for data sources, they're interesting. I mean, we have been looking at environmental sources and ways for antibiotic consumption. It's AMR week this week, and my country, Greece, is #1 always in consumption. And interestingly enough, Corona should not have had much effect on antibiotics, but it appears to be topping the charts. Lindsey, very quickly, you mentioned, because I'm now rotating back, and I wish I had you for much more time, but we only have 10 minutes left. So you mentioned patient safety, I think, a couple of times. And we have had cases for drug-device combinations over recent years with a lot of issues from different companies discussing safety. How do you catch a safety signal? Does it come from a small registry? Should it come, And we've seen both good lessons, even without explicitly mentioning examples. We've seen cases where there was thought to be a safety signal and claims analysis, sometimes also, very specific area centers identify, showed that this was not the case, and the other way around. So how do you see, not for HTA only, but for broader safety, or not for, if you like, coverage and reimbursement, but for public health wider? How do you see, or where do you see that sitting in? And also, how useful is it to the industry to, invest in the right kind of design? Because traditionally, we only look post-marketing at a limited amount of time, unless we have a new iteration of a device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, good question. I think a couple things. It depends on what safety outcomes and if they're measurable and what data sources, like to go to Masood's point. I think a lot of people jump to say, oh, you can measure, death, so we should, but then getting into the nitty gritty of it, you realize like, just because, mortality is present in a data set doesn't mean it's accurate or reliable, so I think it depends first on the safety outcome or measure that is of purpose. But I think a big challenge for medical devices, and it's a little different, I think, than drugs, is the inability to identify our products in these data sources at a large scale. And so, drugs have national drug codes. They have ability to know what drug is being used, what dose, what manufacturer, where devices haven't historically had that. And so now with like more advances in linking capabilities, that's where we're really in this kind of newer frontier, at least as the industry, where we're bringing together device registration data with secondary sources, and then you actually identify the widget, the product. And so like that's the first challenge, to overcome, and seeing how you can expand the population being included in safety analyses and studies. Because right now, like you said, it's small. It depends on how you set these things up. And so the first ability to be able to identify the product then opens up this avenue of how can you begin to broaden the data and do true safety signal work.
Thank you. Catherine, we don't have time to go into IDMP and discuss identifying products and so on. And this should be separate, but it's a very interesting point for Lindsey if we come to drugs, because many drug manufacturers would argue that devices have more data. So it's a very interesting conversation. But
I would like to highlight this, that this is a very important point. Essentially, when we are talking about crossing jurisdiction barriers, I would also like to highlight in the identification space, besides devices and drugs and the device-drug combinations, the health apps space. In the United States, since we are using the United States as an example, a new initiative that is coming up is actually identifying specific health apps. And you probably all are aware that now in selective cases, as in diabetes, we do have cases of prescribing apps to patients.
In Europe too,
yeah.
we already have.
So one of the things that HTA should consider for the future, and that is a real evidence for standards, is how we can benefit from more accurate information correlating drug therapies with apps and devices in the context of real world data. This is a big challenge, but it would certainly boost the accuracy of the data that we collect, especially if we respect privacy through technologies that are appropriate.
Thanks, Catherine. Dimitra, circling back to you, last but not least, from a payer perspective now, the information that you have in terms of registries and so on, and normally sits, it's not only claims data, it's quite contextual. Can it be harvested backwards, if you like? So can you look at retrospective data, and is it meaningful to do it? And does a payer have the capacity to do it in terms of informing registrational efforts and even providing input to device manufacturers and drug manufacturers?
Well, from a payer's perspective, this is a very challenging issue because we are affronting important GDPR barriers. We have registries for medical devices, but recently the Ministry of Health DPO issued an opinion, and we were asked to apply the right to be forgotten in our registries. That means that a rather useful registry with information for a specific product that goes back a certain period of time should be limited because according to this opinion, we should only keep data 9 months old data. So we affront, we do have some challenging issues to affront. And I think that we have a lot of issues to deal in the field of registries, but certainly for us, two registries contain a very important information, but up to now only a limited, a fragmented part is what we can share with the industry due to those limitations.
Thank you.
And also due, excuse me, and also due to commercial
PCI.
Yes, PCI information that
yeah. Okay. But thank you, because then we can touch upon access and whether to what extent the payers actually cross-talk with regulatory authorities, because that has been a challenge, I think, both for Europe and other areas. But before we close, we have 2-3 minutes, because this was the essence of this, was to see whether we can cross-talk in an interdisciplinary manner, so for collaboration. So I would like one very brief statement, 10-second statement or 20-second statement from each one of you on what we should prioritize when we discuss collaboration. Dimitri, I have to start with you again.
Well,
don't know
I
how
think
much,
that
from a lawyer, apologies. I don't know how much. I know you got a lot of acronyms from us, so I don't know if all of them were clear, but
for me, it is very crucial to have a dialogue between the disciplines, because the barrier for a legal officer, for a lawyer, is that most of the times they come to us very, very late, when all of the procedure is already formulated, and we have so little to help. Thank you.
thank you. So come to us earlier. Catherine, probably will say the same thing, I think. I can't hear you.
I think you're on mute, Catherine.
I was muted as usual, you know, the most frequent statement online. What comes to mind listening to us certainly is two things. First of all, that we need to be more active in pursuing the practice of interprofessionalism. And second, that we need to pay more attention to data literacy. And I think these are major points also for HTA. I would like to congratulate you for bringing standards and devices into the picture, but I think we need to look at it from the perspective of data better. Masoud raised a number of very important points about predictive power of data, transferring results from one context to another, to make this relevant in the context of regulations that are essentially protecting, you know, the data. This is what is behind GDPR. We want to protect the data. But if we don't have data, we don't have anything to protect and nothing to apply algorithms and AI on. So we have to be careful there on balancing the different requirements. It's a balancing act. So data literacy, I would like to repeat, awareness and the practice of interprofessionalism are extremely important elements that will define the next decade. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing on board literacy. We do need, this is just one, we did say this is the first of a series of workshops, and we will need time to build upon it. Too many different things to discuss, including AI. Lindsey.
Yeah, I would reiterate everything that's been said, but I would say too that from a industry perspective, we have a lot of data, and we want. And I before diving right into data, you know, we have our own data, we license data. There's, you know, it's the collaboration across the stakeholders is so critical, that we're designing the right question with the right data, the right methods, before we just dive into data itself. And so really being able to help develop kind of collaboratively protocols and methods and increasing transparency on analyses. I think the perception in real world evidence and real world data has been, you make it say the answer you want, and that's something we all want to avoid, you know. And so just the more we can collaborate earlier and improve that transparency will only improve the rigor and trust in the evidence.
Thank you. So transparency also in collaboration, indeed, not just. And Masoud, last but certainly not least.
Yeah, it's over. We are over time, so
I think we're over time by 15 minutes, but okay, this was enjoyable. So
I would make it very
nobody's
short.
major meeting, please.
Yeah, I wanted to just you know, to leave an image from this session for the audience, to say that I would like you to keep the image of data and evidence like the chicken and egg, actually. So, you know, the debate of if the chicken was first or the egg was first, and which one is more important than the other one. Here, with regards to data and evidence, we have the same thing. And our studies show that actually good quality data pushes for an increased number of articles based on that data. So this is the data here, this example, that pushes for evidence, and more requests for evidence from data also pushes for better quality of data. So the more we practice it, the more the perfect it will become. So with these words, I would also like to invite the audience, our audience, to join our interest group, because this is actually a panel which is endorsed by our interest group. And if you're interested in any of these topics, please join us. And we will welcome you, and we will be more than happy to collaborate with you in the real world evidence and artificial intelligence interest group.
Thank you all very, very much. I'm sorry again that we had connectivity issues in the beginning. And thanks very much for engaging so much with each other despite having very different perspectives. And best wishes for a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Elena, for this nice panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Masood. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bryce, Lorena too, huh?
Thanks, Bryce.
Thanks, Lorena. Bye-bye.
And Lorena with a nice background.
Certainly.
Thank you.